not normally a big one for middle of the year lists, but this year I think something pretty special will have to come to knock Paul Schrader's First Reformed off from near the top of my rankings. To some people that might seem strange because, well, First Reformed, it's a film about a priest and I'm an atheist, so how can I possibly connect to it? And besides, aren't most films about Christianity a bit, you know, bad? Of course, religious films are a pretty broad church. When we talk about faith in film, you might think of the strange, hypnotic Buddhist cinema of Apichatpong vis-a-vis, or the dryly funny Jewish allegories that the Coen brothers occasionally produce, but it's not what most people think of when they talk about religious cinema. What most people think about, in the West at least, is films about Christianity. But the debate's even narrower than that, really. I mean, if you're any kind of fan of canonical European art house cinema, then some of your favourite films will be, in some way or another, Christian films. But when we talk about Christianity in cinema, we're just not talking about Bergman or Bresson these days. It's not really my intent to make fun of films like God's Not Dead or Fireproof, the low-budget 2008 melodrama that really kick-started the thing. Don't get me wrong, I think they're bad, but they're so not for me that it almost feels pointless criticising them. Instead, I want to look at where they come from, why they flourished, and what sort of niche they fill. For a lot of evangelists, Hollywood is inherently a pretty suspicious place. That suspicion's been brewing a long time. The modern religious right started developing in the 1970s out of the wreckage of the hippie movement. It would be fair to say that when they looked at the gritty new Hollywood of the 1970s or the ultra-violent action cycle of the 1980s, they saw little in there that they enjoyed. The first clarion call of the religious right's suspicion of Hollywood came when the author Michael Medved, one of the founders of the Golden Turkey Awards to find the worst movie ever made, came out with a book called Hollywood vs. America. Hollywood vs. America accuses Hollywood of turning its backs on what the American people want to see and following its own dark, destructive obsessions. I have to say that I find it a pretty unpersuasive book, not least because the films Medved uses as examples of how Hollywood has lost touch with heartland American values are things like The Silence of the Lambs, which were massive hits at the American box office. But the argument stuck. It's not as if Hollywood has completely given up on trying to appeal to Christian audiences after all. After Mel Gibson stepped outside the system to make The Passion of the Christ, a wave of faith-based film projects were put in motion by major studios with the hope of repeating that success, but none of them did. When you look at the post-Passion of the Christ wave of films about faith, most of them went wrong because of something related to the directors or the actors being passed around on Christian websites. People scoured back through interviews with Ridley Scott when Exodus, Gods and Kings came out. People had a field day looking for quotes they disapproved of from Darren Aronofsky when Noah came out. The Nativity story, being one of the most bleakly funny examples of this, was derailed when it was found out that its teenage star, Keisha Castle-Hughes, was pregnant, and I mean, you can't have a pregnant teenager playing the Virgin Mary, right? Again, it's not like I don't understand the impulse evangelical audiences have to make sure a new film about their faith is by them, for them. We all have our own things in life that are sort of like religious causes to us. And I think the rise of identity politics means that a lot of us now are looking for representation in much the same way that evangelicals do, even if neither side would probably like to admit to the comparison. But here's the thing, a lot of Christian audiences in America look back to Golden Age Hollywood as an example of what they'd like to see Hollywood do. Big movies made by serious directors with A-list stars that won Oscars, won awards at film festivals, and were also unapologetically Christian in their content. What's wrong with that? Well, part of what's wrong with that might be that audiences back in the 1950s and 60s didn't know that the script for Ben-Hur was co-written by a gay left-wing novelist, or that King of Kings was directed by a bisexual man. There's also the flip side to this, which I think can be illustrated in the work of Terrence Malick. Now, despite some recent wobbles, I do still count myself as an ardent card-carrying fan of Terrence Malick. I think at his best in films like The New World and Days of Heaven, he is simply extraordinary. His work is also explicitly Christian. Knight of Cups takes inspiration from the Gnostic Gospels. Days of Heaven is a disguised retelling of the Genesis story of Abraham and Sarah. The Tree of Life begins with a quotation from the Book of Job. Javier Bardem has a significant role as a priest in To the Wonder. And every now and then one of the smarter evangelical critics will say, "Why are my brethren not going for this? This is exactly what you want." But to the audience who are combing through statements by Ridley Scott to find out if Exodus Gods and Kings is going to be the real deal, there's a problem in embracing Terrence Malick. The problem is that he doesn't talk. What they're looking for, more than anything else, is a filmmaker who will not only make identifiably Christian-themed movies, but who will stand up and say, "Yes, I am a Christian, these are my values, I work as a Christian in Hollywood." Terrence Malick won't say that, because Terrence Malick doesn't say anything by and large. To understand the religious content of a Terrence Malick film, you would have to actually analyse the film. And that's when we come on to our second problem. I started this by talking about First Reformed, but I could have easily started it by talking about Martin Scorsese, Schrader's old friend, who just last year made a movie that he's been working towards for over 25 years. It was called Silence. It was a film about the historical persecution of Christians in Japan, whose stars, Adam Driver, Liam Neeson and Andrew Garfield, all played Jesuit missionaries. Again, you think he is the jackpot. Big stars, big director, a big budget. It didn't happen. It didn't come off. The studio were actually quite surprised that Silence didn't earn more money, which I personally find their surprise surprising. I mean, it's not like it can catch a wave of big hit Jesuit-related cinema. But it didn't hit big with a Christian audience for two reasons. Firstly, a lot of them still don't trust Scorsese after The Last Temptation of Christ. Ironically, it's the only film which feels like it has a sense of the enormity of what it meant for Jesus to actually lose a human body. That he's not just God, he's God and man, and when he dies on the cross, he comes back, yes, but he really dies.
It is the conscience.
Jesus losing his human body in Gibson's film just means he's lost something that can be successfully scourged. Jesus losing his life in Scorsese's film means that he's lost his life. Well, it was so unpopular that at the Oscars that year, Scorsese turned up with 8 bodyguards, 1 for each death threat he had received. Imagine how high that would be if he'd had Twitter back then. Secondly, Silence is really hard to get to grips with. I remember seeing it at Cineworld and thinking, I cannot think of a film that I've seen in a legitimate art house theatre that demands more interpretive effort from its audience than this. But this was being shown in a multiplex. It had a trailer that really broke its back to make you think that this was going to be a big Mel Gibson style historical action movie. But it isn't. It's a film which asks, what is the right thing to do when you see a crisis of faith? Is it more important to have an inward faith or to evangelise? Is it possible to lead a good Christian life while still not showing your faith to the outside world? Is it more important to save someone's physical body or their immortal soul? And its solution was, I give that to you. I think that's great. I'm always looking for films that I can chew about and have arguments about months after they come out, and Silence absolutely fits the bill in that regard. But it also makes it an art house movie. In his book Which Lie Did I Tell?, William Goldman writes that the difference between art house and mainstream movies is not one of quality, it's this. Mainstream movies give you answers. Art house movies ask questions. He points to Shakespeare in Love, which was a current big hit at the time he wrote the book, and says that was a mainstream movie that prospered because it made people think it was art house. I mean, it's got to be art house, right? It's Shakespeare, it doesn't get more arty than that. But at the end of Shakespeare in Love, you're left with the sensation that anything is possible, any writer's block can be got over if you have the love of a good woman. And that's an answer that Hollywood's always had great success selling to audiences. Most of the low-budget evangelical films are in the business of providing answers. Something like The Genius Club starts off by asking every question in the world. What shall we do about climate change? What's to be done about terrorism? Why is there so much crime now? And in each case the answer is found to be Jesus. When Scorsese comes into a situation which appears at first blush to be morally simple, and the way that he depicts the torture and execution of Christians is the one unambiguous thing in Silence, he is dead clear that this is the wrong thing to be happening. But everything else is complex, everything else is murky. It's hard to say for sure whether anyone in the film does the right thing at any point. That's not what a religious audience, particularly in America, really want from their films. They want answers. They are, in their own way, a mainstream audience. I wish I could remember where I read this, but I was reading a discussion about evangelical films online, and one commenter said that he grew up in an evangelical household, and he said that in his opinion, the main thing that made evangelical art so often bad was that evangelical Christians don't really trust metaphor. I found that a strange statement at first. I mean, how do you mistrust metaphor? It's just an idea. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. What will be an evangelical Christian's main encounter with the concept of a metaphor? Well, assuming that they don't teach in the literature department of a university, it will probably be some wiseacre like me coming up to them and saying, of course, the book of Genesis is intended as a metaphor for creation, not an actual factual creation story. That sticks with people. That creates an impression that metaphor is not just a way of talking about something, it's a way of slipping something under your nose. If you think I'm going too far, consider the evangelical response to one of this year's big movie talking points, Guillermo del Toro's Best Picture winner, The Shape of Water. I have seen so many writers, from the commenters on evangelical blogs to actual above-the-line writers like Dreyer, say that The Shape of Water is a film that promotes bestiality. Again, hashtag not all evangelicals, but that is the way that a lot of people are looking at it. And what's interesting, the more you dig into these accounts, is that when The Shape of Water is being explicitly political, they get it. When it's talking about discrimination against homosexuals, they get it. When it's talking about the Cold War, they get it. When it talks about McCarthyism, they understand that this is absolutely a thing that Guillermo del Toro is saying in the text of the movie. But that's the thing, it's the text. When it comes to the relationship between Sally Hawkins and this character and the creature, which most secular critics could easily identify as a metaphor for the sense of outsiderdom and estrangement that comes from being one of the groups at the business end of the social trends that I've just mentioned, they wouldn't do that. They preferred to see it literally, and they generally thought that they'd sussed Del Toro out. The pointy heads, again, like me, were saying, no, but that relationship it's a metaphor for discrimination. To which they all thought, oh yeah, metaphor, I've heard that one before. Metaphor is what secular people use to get things under our nose. It's not a metaphor, you want to f*** fish. Which, in the interests of honest dialogue, I don't. But it's hard to really create great art with that attitude. If you look at the evangelical films, a lot of them are literal from their title down. God's not dead, heaven is for real. They tend to begin with a character in some kind of crisis, a crisis which could have happened for any number of reasons, but by the time the end has come, you are in no doubt. This is happening because of God. God is the answer to this. It's like the flight from metaphor, the flight from ambiguity. The world of a film like First Reformed, where a priest is faced with difficult challenges and, yes, uses his faith to navigate them, but is aware that the answers might be complex or contradictory, isn't the same world as these evangelical films. And you might be wondering at this point, well Graham, what's your skin in the game? Evangelical films tend to end by saying the answer is Jesus. Well, fancy that. Evangelicals like to evangelise. Why are you, an atheist, so wrapped up in this? And I think it's because when a religious film works, it can be a way of talking about morality in a more difficult and direct and aggressive way than any secular drama ever could. And I grew up in a Christian household, and the morality of Christianity is still something that's a strand in my DNA. I mentioned a lot earlier of Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, and that film had a very strange effect on me. When it came out, I found it repulsive. I thought, here is a version of Christ who has almost no spiritual or moral content whatsoever, and whose only remarkable feature is that he can take a real beating and get up again at the end of it. It's the kind of movie about Jesus that you would absolutely expect a slightly mad form of action movie star to make. And I thought, that's abhorrent, that's against my idea of Christianity, that's against my personal faith in Jesus as someone who cares for the meek and turns the other cheek and does other things which, although they don't rhyme like those two do, have much the same ethos. And I reread the Gospels that night and I realised that ultimately I liked these as pieces of moral philosophy, but I didn't find any serious reason to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Maybe Gibson's film had shown me something. Maybe it was like a tool for de-evangelising, that it made me realise that my only investment in the biblical story was as a series of mostly pretty good, some slightly cranky rules for living. In a strange way, wanting Christian films to be better is kind of like my equivalent of being one of these people who goes on the internet and rants about how the new Thundercats or She-Ra isn't like he remembers it is. I want to be able to go to a Christian film and think, yes, that's the faith I remember. I might not have it now, I might not be able to go back, but it was nice visiting again.